1356 arrived with Ottoman forces, emboldened by their successful establishment of permanent presence at Gallipoli 2 years earlier, and now commanded by an increasingly confident cadre of experienced officers who had learned their craft through decades of Anatolian sieges, beginning systematic expansion into the fertile plains and strategic towns of Thrace with a methodical precision that revealed how far Ottoman military organization had evolved from the tribal raiding bands of previous generations. The Thracian countryside, stretching from the Dardanelles northward toward the approaches to Constantinople and westward toward the Marsa River Valley, represented some of the richest agricultural land in the Byzantine Empire, studded with prosperous towns whose production fed the capital and whose tax revenues had sustained imperial administration for centuries. Now these towns faced a new reality: Ottoman armies advancing with overwhelming force, offering generous surrender terms to those who submitted peacefully while demonstrating ruthless efficiency against those foolish enough to resist. The campaigns that would unfold over the remaining years of the 1350s would not feature dramatic pitched battles or legendary sieges comparable to earlier Ottoman conquests, but rather would consist of dozens of smaller operations that collectively achieved strategic transformation as profound as any single spectacular victory. The systematic reduction of Byzantine Thrace from imperial heartland to Ottoman province, accomplished through patient application of military pressure, sophisticated diplomacy, and effective governance that made Ottoman rule appear inevitable and even potentially preferable to the dysfunctional Byzantine administration it replaced. The Byzantine strategic position in Thrace during the mid-1350s presented a picture of almost complete helplessness that explained why Ottoman expansion proceeded with such stunning speed, despite the territory's importance to the empire's survival. Emperor John V Palaiologos, barely approaching his mid-20s, but already bearing the psychological scars of civil war and military disasters, commanded an empire that had been reduced to Constantinople's scattered coastal holdings and a rapidly shrinking Thracian interior that was being systematically conquered by forces he could neither defeat militarily nor repel diplomatically. The Byzantine military capacity in the region consisted of inadequate garrison forces in various towns and fortresses, occasional relief expeditions assembled from Constantinople's limited resources, and local militia whose training and equipment were laughably inadequate for confronting professional Ottoman warriors. The empire's financial situation was equally desperate, with the treasury so depleted by previous civil wars and ongoing military emergencies that paying even the modest forces available proved chronically difficult, leading to the kind of delayed payments and broken promises that destroyed soldier morale and made desertion, or switching sides to better paying Ottoman service, an attractive option for Byzantine warriors facing professional ruin. The Ottoman military organization conducting the Thracian campaigns demonstrated the sophisticated institutional development that Sultan Orhan had fostered throughout his reign, transforming what had begun as a frontier beylik's tribal levies into something approaching a professional standing army, capable of conducting simultaneous operations across extensive territories. The forces operating in Thrace included multiple components: elite cavalry Sipahi, holding Timur estates, who provided reliable core of experienced warriors motivated by both religious ideology and material interests; professional infantry units receiving regular treasury payments who could conduct siege operations and garrison conquered towns; tribal auxiliary forces whose mobility and raiding capabilities complemented the more organized regular units; and increasingly, Christian auxiliaries including Greeks who had entered Ottoman service, recognizing that fighting for the winning side offered better prospects than loyalty to a dying empire. This diverse force structure, unified through Ottoman administrative systems and command hierarchy, could operate effectively across the dispersed geography of Thrace, conducting multiple sieges simultaneously while maintaining secure supply lines and responding flexibly to Byzantine resistance efforts. The tactical approach Ottoman forces employed in the Thracian campaigns reflected lessons learned from decades of siege warfare in Anatolia, emphasizing economic strangulation and psychological pressure over costly direct assaults that might achieve quick victories but at unacceptable casualties. When Ottoman forces approached a Byzantine-held town or fortress, the standard procedure followed well-established patterns. Cavalry would surround the target and cut all land communications, preventing supplies from entering or messengers from leaving. Engineers would establish siege camps and begin constructing offensive works while ensuring Ottoman forces could be supplied from rear areas, and simultaneously, diplomatic envoys would enter the besieged location under flag of truce to deliver Ottoman surrender terms. These terms, refined through years of practice, offered extraordinarily generous conditions to populations willing to submit peacefully, Garrison forces could withdraw to Byzantine territory with their weapons and honor intact. Civilians could choose to leave or stay with guaranteed religious freedom and property protection. Local elites who cooperated would retain positions and privileges under Ottoman administration, and taxes would be reduced compared to Byzantine rates. The psychological impact of these offers, especially when besieged populations could observe other towns that had accepted Ottoman terms continuing to prosper, proved devastating to resistance morale and encouraged surrender negotiations even before serious fighting commenced. The first major Ottoman conquest of the Thracian campaigns came with the capture of Didymotocon in 1356. A fortified town approximately 40 miles northwest of the Gallipoli Peninsula, whose strategic position controlling roads connecting Constantinople with the empire's remaining Balkan territories made it a prize whose loss would further isolate the Byzantine capital. The town's garrison, numbering perhaps 800 soldiers supplemented by armed citizens, initially pledged determined resistance to Ottoman siege, trusting in their fortifications and hoping for relief from Constantinople that Byzantine authorities promised but could not realistically deliver. Yet as Ottoman forces established a complete blockade, as weeks passed without Byzantine relief appearing, and as Ottoman envoys repeatedly presented increasingly generous surrender terms, the garrison's resolve weakened. Factional divisions emerged within the town between those insisting on continued resistance and pragmatists arguing that accepting Ottoman offers would preserve lives and property, while futile resistance would only delay inevitable defeat. After approximately 3 months of siege that involved minimal actual combat but constant psychological pressure, Didymoticon's garrison negotiated surrender on terms that allowed them to withdraw honorably while the civilian population remained under guaranteed Ottoman protection. The town's peaceful capitulation established a precedent that would be replicated dozens of times over subsequent years, as other Byzantine towns recognized that resistance was hopeless, and that Ottoman terms, while requiring submission to Turkish Muslim authority, were genuinely more generous than what most medieval conquerors offered. The administrative integration of conquered Thracian territories into the Ottoman system proceeded with the same systematic attention to effective governance that had characterized Ottoman rule in Anatolia, demonstrating that the empire had developed institutional capabilities that could be scaled to manage expanding territories without losing effectiveness. Ottoman administrators arrived in newly conquered towns accompanied by qadis trained in Islamic law, treasury officials to conduct surveys and establish tax systems, military commanders to organize garrison forces, and often Greek Christian advisors who could facilitate communication with local populations and provide expertise about Byzantine administrative practices worth preserving. The surveys conducted in each conquered territory documented property ownership, agricultural productivity, tax obligations, and demographic details with thoroughness that enabled Ottoman authorities to implement the Timar system efficiently, while also identifying which Byzantine administrative practices should be maintained because they worked effectively. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Halil Nalsik and Heath Lowry, whose detailed studies of Ottoman administrative records document this expansion period, the institutional structures established in Thracian territories during the 1350s replicated successful Anatolian models while adapting to the specific circumstances of governing predominantly Christian populations in regions where Byzantine administrative traditions were more deeply rooted than in the Anatolian territories the Ottomans had previously conquered. The experience of Greek Christian populations in Thracian towns facing Ottoman conquest revealed complex realities of medieval warfare and occupation that defied simple narratives of Muslim oppression versus Christian resistance, as ordinary people navigated impossible choices between loyalty to their ancestral faith and empire versus pragmatic accommodation with conquerors whose governance often proved more effective than the Byzantine administration it replaced. When Ottoman forces appeared before a town's walls, the population faced agonizing calculations. Resisting might result in lengthy siege, starvation, eventual storming of the walls followed by the sacking that medieval military customs permitted for cities taken by assault, and possible enslavement or massacre of survivors. Alternatively, negotiating peaceful surrender offered guaranteed religious freedom, property protection, and often better governance with lower taxation than Byzantine authorities had provided. The choice, though framed in contemporary Byzantine religious rhetoric as a test of faith and loyalty, was for most practical people a matter of survival and quality of life rather than abstract political principle. Many Thracian Greeks, comparing Ottoman promises with the Byzantine track record of broken promises and extractive taxation, concluded that Turkish Muslim governance with guaranteed Christian worship rights was preferable to Byzantine Christian governance that provided neither security nor prosperity. The collaboration between Ottoman authorities and Greek Christian local elites in newly conquered Thracian territories demonstrated the pragmatic basis on which multi-religious empires functioned in medieval contexts, as both sides recognized mutual interests in establishing stable governance that could benefit conquerors and conquered alike. Ottoman administrators, understanding that they lacked sufficient Turkish personnel to govern vast new territories populated overwhelmingly by Greeks, actively recruited local Christian aristocrats, merchants, and administrators into Ottoman provincial governance by offering them positions that preserved or even enhanced their status and wealth. Greek elites, recognizing that their property, social positions, and economic interests depended on whoever controlled political power rather than on abstract loyalty to Byzantine emperors who could no longer protect them, often proved willing to serve Ottoman authorities in exchange for the security and opportunities Ottoman governance provided. This collaboration, though condemned as treason by Byzantine loyalists and later Greek nationalist historians, represented a rational calculation of self-interest by local elites whose primary concern was preserving their families' positions and properties, regardless of whether the distant ruler was a Byzantine emperor or an Ottoman sultan. The system worked effectively for both sides. Ottomans gained experienced administrators who understood local conditions and could manage Christian populations, while Greek elites maintained their privileged positions despite the political transformation. The religious dimensions of the Ottoman conquest created profound anxieties and theological debates within Orthodox Christian communities about whether accepting Muslim political authority constituted unforgivable betrayal of faith, or was a permissible accommodation that preserved Christian religious practice even while submitting politically to infidel governance. Orthodox bishops and theologians grappled with competing scriptural and theological traditions. Some texts emphasized the importance of Christian political authority and suggested that living under Muslim rule compromised faith regardless of guarantees about religious practice. Other traditions distinguished between spiritual loyalty to Christ and pragmatic political submission to whoever held temporal power, suggesting that maintaining Christian worship even under Muslim governance was acceptable and perhaps even preferable to feudal resistance that would result in Christian debts without achieving meaningful results. The accommodationist position gradually prevailed in most communities, justified through theological arguments that spiritual faithfulness to Orthodox Christianity mattered more than the religious identity of political rulers, and that preserving Christian communities even under Ottoman governance served God's purposes better than martyrdom and hopeless resistance. This theological accommodation, formalized through the millet system that would grant the Orthodox Church hierarchy substantial authority over Christian communities in exchange for political loyalty to the Ottoman state, enabled coexistence between Muslim Turkish rulers and Christian Greek subjects that would characterize the Ottoman Balkans for centuries. The economic impact of Ottoman conquest on Thracian towns and agricultural regions proved surprisingly mixed, with some populations experiencing genuine improvement in material conditions under Turkish governance, while others suffered from the disruptions and uncertainties inevitably associated with military conquest and political transformation. The immediate conquest period typically involved economic disruption as warfare interrupted agricultural cycles, commerce ceased during sieges, and the uncertainty about political futures discouraged investment and normal economic activity. Yet once Ottoman administration was established and initial disruptions passed, many Thracian regions experienced economic revival as Ottoman policies of lower taxation, vigorous anti-corruption enforcement, protection for merchants and travelers, and integration into the larger Ottoman commercial system created a more favorable business environment than late Byzantine governance had provided. Greek Christian merchants discovered that Ottoman markets were often more profitable than Byzantine territories where chronic political instability, predatory taxation by desperate imperial authorities, and weak governance that could not suppress brigandage or enforce contracts undermined commerce. Agricultural productivity in some regions actually increased under Ottoman rule as the Timar system's incentive structures encouraged development, and the relative stability Ottoman governance provided allowed farmers to invest in improvements without fear that Byzantine tax collectors would immediately confiscate any surplus through emergency levies. The military evolution of Ottoman forces conducting the Thracian campaigns revealed how constant warfare and expanding operational requirements drove organizational and tactical innovation that would shape the Ottoman military system for generations. The experience of conducting multiple simultaneous sieges across a dispersed geography required developing sophisticated logistics systems that can supply numerous garrisons from centralized resources while maintaining flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. The challenge of besieging fortified towns defended by populations who understood that Ottoman conquest would be permanent motivated the refinement of psychological warfare techniques and surrender negotiation procedures that could induce capitulation without costly assaults, the need to garrison dozens of newly conquered towns while maintaining sufficient mobile forces for ongoing offensive operations drove the expansion of the Ottoman military establishment and experimentation with different troop types and organizational structures, perhaps most significantly. The extensive interaction with Byzantine military systems and Greek Christian warriors who entered Ottoman service exposed Turkish commanders to different tactical approaches, weapons technologies, and organizational concepts that could be adapted to enhance Ottoman capabilities. The military institution that emerged from the Thracian campaigns was more sophisticated, diverse, and capable than what had begun the decade, demonstrating the Ottoman capacity for learning and adaptation that would enable centuries of successful expansion. The Byzantine diplomatic efforts to contain or reverse Ottoman expansion in Thrace during the late 1350s revealed both the empire's continuing desperation and the fundamental ineffectiveness of diplomacy unsupported by military capability or credible incentives. Emperor John V sent urgent embassies throughout Christian Europe describing the Ottoman threat and pleading for crusading assistance. Yet these appeals generated rhetorical sympathy but minimal concrete help, given European preoccupation with the 100 Years' War and Italian conflicts. Byzantine diplomatic approaches to the papacy seeking reconciliation between Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for Western military assistance founded on mutual theological suspicions and Byzantine unwillingness to accept Catholic religious authority, even to obtain desperately needed military support. Most humiliatingly, Byzantine envoys approached various Balkan Christian powers, including Serbia and Bulgaria, seeking alliances against the common Ottoman threat, only to discover that these kingdoms viewed Byzantine weakness as an opportunity for their own territorial expansion rather than a crisis requiring Christian solidarity. The comprehensive failure of Byzantine diplomatic efforts demonstrated that an empire possessing neither military strength nor economic resources to offer potential allies commanded no international leverage, regardless of how desperately it appealed to religious sentiment or historical prestige. 1357 and 1358 witnessed the Ottoman Thracian campaigns intensifying as Sultan Orhan, now in his late 60s, but still actively engaged in strategic direction even as he delegated increasing operational authority to his son Murad, authorized expansion of military operations beyond the immediate Gallipoli hinterland, deeper into Byzantine Europe with clear strategic objective of creating secure Ottoman zone extending to the approaches of Constantinople itself. The campaigns during these years followed patterns established in 1356, but on a larger scale and with greater sophistication as Ottoman commanders applied lessons learned from initial operations to refine their methods and accelerate the pace of conquest. Multiple Ottoman armies operated simultaneously in different regions of Thrace, conducting coordinated campaigns that prevented Byzantine forces from concentrating against any single threat while systematically reducing the network of towns and fortresses that had provided the empire's defensive infrastructure. The strategic coordination required for these multi-theater operations demonstrated Ottoman institutional maturity and command competence that rivaled any contemporary military organization in Europe or the Middle East. The capture of Adrianople, Edirne, in 1358 represented the Ottoman Thracian campaign's most significant strategic achievement, as this major city's conquest provided the expanding empire with an urban center whose size, commercial importance, and geographic position would make it the Ottoman capital for European operations and eventually the empire's overall capital until Constantinople's final conquest. Adrianople, strategically located at the confluence of the Tunza and Maritsa rivers, approximately 120 miles northwest of Constantinople, controlled vital roads connecting the Byzantine capital with remaining imperial territories in the Balkans, and served as a major commercial hub whose markets facilitated trade throughout the region. The city's fortifications, though formidable, had been inadequately maintained due to Byzantine financial constraints, and its garrison proved woefully insufficient for defending the extensive walls against a determined siege. The Ottoman approach to Adrianople followed now standard procedures: complete blockade cutting all land communications, systematic application of pressure through siege works and occasional probing attacks, and constant diplomatic contact offering generous surrender terms. The city's resistance, sustained initially by hope for Byzantine relief that never materialized in adequate strength, gradually dissolved as factions within Adrianople recognized that surrender was inevitable, and that negotiating while the garrison retained some bargaining leverage would secure better terms than waiting until starvation forced unconditional capitulation. The negotiated surrender in late 1358 allowed the garrison to withdraw with honors while the civilian population remained under guaranteed Ottoman protection. And within months, Ottoman authorities had transformed Adrianople into a thriving administrative and commercial center, whose prosperity under Turkish governance contrasted sharply with the decline it had experienced during Byzantium's final decades. The Ottoman decision to make Adrianople the capital of their European territories and eventually to relocate the overall imperial capital there from Bursa reflected sophisticated strategic thinking about how geography shaped governance effectiveness and how symbolic choices about capitals conveyed messages about dynastic priorities and imperial ambitions. Adrianople's central position in Ottoman-controlled Thrace made it an ideal administrative center for governing expanding European possessions, far more convenient than attempting to manage European territories from Bursa across the Dardanelles in Asia. The city's size and economic vitality provided resources and prestige appropriate for an imperial capital, while its formidable fortifications offered security against potential Christian counterattacks. Most significantly, establishing the capital in Europe rather than Asia, unmistakably, that Ottoman imperial ambitions now focused primarily on European expansion rather than further Anatolian conquests, a strategic reorientation that would shape the empire's trajectory for the next century, as successive sultans prioritized Balkan expansion over operations in Asia or against other Turkish beyliks. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Simal Kafadar, whose studies of Ottoman political culture examine how symbolic choices reflected and shaped imperial identity, the relocation of the capital to Adrianople marked the Ottomans' transformation from an Anatolian Turkish beylik into a European empire whose political center of gravity had shifted decisively westward. The military innovations that emerged from the Thracian campaigns included refinements to siege warfare techniques that would enable Ottoman forces to reduce fortified positions more efficiently while minimizing casualties that earlier sieges had sometimes imposed. Ottoman engineers, drawing on expertise acquired from captured Byzantine specialists and from observation of European fortification and siege techniques, developed more sophisticated siege equipment, including improved trebuchets, battering rams, and, increasingly, early gunpowder weapons whose psychological impact often exceeded their actual destructive capabilities. Given the crude state of 14th century artillery, more importantly, Ottoman siege doctrine evolved to emphasize even more strongly the combination of military pressure and diplomatic inducement, recognizing that convincing defenders to surrender through offers they found acceptable achieved objectives more efficiently than breaching walls through prolonged bombardment or assault. The development of standardized surrender terms that could be offered consistently across different sieges created expectations among defenders about what submission would entail, reducing the uncertainty that might otherwise have encouraged prolonged resistance. These innovations, though individually modest, collectively improved Ottoman operational efficiency and enabled the rapid pace of conquest that characterized the late 1350s Thracian campaigns. The logistical challenges of sustaining multiple simultaneous military operations across the dispersed geography of Thrace drove the development of Ottoman supply systems that would support the empire's expansion for centuries. The campaigns required feeding, equipping, and paying thousands of warriors operating at various locations, some engaged in active siege operations requiring artillery and engineering equipment, others garrisoning newly conquered towns, still others conducting mobile operations against Byzantine resistance or raiding for supplies and intelligence. Meeting these diverse logistical requirements while operating in foreign territory populated by potentially hostile Christians demanded sophisticated supply organization, including secure communications routes connecting forward positions with bases at Gallipoli and eventually Adrianople, convoy systems to transport supplies protected against interdiction, magazines strategically positioned to support operations in different regions, and most challengingly, methods for requisitioning local supplies without alienating civilian populations whose cooperation was essential for stable governance. The logistical structures developed during the Thracian campaigns, though they would continue evolving, established core principles and practices that enabled Ottoman military operations across vast distances from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the Caucasus, demonstrating how unglamorous but essential administrative competence underlay the empire's military achievements. The psychological warfare dimensions of the Thracian campaigns became increasingly sophisticated as Ottoman commanders recognized that shaping enemy perceptions and morale could achieve strategic objectives as effectively as military operations while avoiding casualties and resource expenditure. Ottoman forces systematically cultivated a reputation for overwhelming military superiority, combined with honorable dealing and generous treatment of those who submitted peacefully, creating an incentive structure where resistance appeared both futile and potentially costly, while surrender seemed not just inevitable but potentially beneficial. Ottoman propaganda emphasized stories of towns that had accepted Turkish governance and prospered, while carefully disseminating accounts of the few locations that had resisted and suffered consequences. Ottoman envoys conducted sophisticated negotiations with Byzantine garrison commanders, identifying factional divisions that could be exploited, offering personalized inducements to influential individuals whose defection would undermine collective resistance, and consistently demonstrating that Ottoman promises were genuine rather than tactical deceptions abandoned once resistance ended. This comprehensive psychological campaign proved at least as important as military operations in explaining the extraordinary speed with which Ottoman forces conquered Thrace, as it created an atmosphere where each Ottoman success made subsequent conquests easier by reinforcing perceptions of Ottoman inevitability. The systematic Turkish settlement of conquered Thracian territories accelerated during the late 1350s as Ottoman authorities implemented colonization programs designed to transform military conquest into a permanent demographic and cultural transformation that would make reversal of Ottoman control increasingly difficult. Even if Christian powers eventually organized effective military resistance, the settlement programs followed patterns established at Gallipoli but on a larger scale, as expanding Ottoman-controlled territories offered more land for distribution to Turkish migrants from Anatolia. The incentives offered to potential settlers remained extraordinarily generous: substantial land grants in fertile agricultural regions, multi-year tax exemptions allowing economic establishment without heavy financial burdens, priority for Timar grants for warriors who distinguished themselves in European campaigns, and guarantees of religious infrastructure with mosques, madrasas, and Islamic courts being established in settled areas. The Ottoman authorities also facilitated practical aspects of migration, providing transportation assistance across the Dardanelles, security for migrants traveling through potentially dangerous territories, and help with initial settlement, including the provision of seeds, tools, and sometimes livestock to enable productive farming from the beginning. The scale of Turkish migration into Thrace during the 1350s and early 1360s, though impossible to quantify precisely given medieval record-keeping limitations, was substantial enough to begin shifting the demographic balance in some regions from exclusively Greek Christian to mixed populations that would eventually become predominantly Turkish Muslim. Estimates by demographic historians suggest that perhaps 20 to 30,000 Turkish settlers migrated to Ottoman-controlled European territories during this period, concentrated particularly around Gallipoli, Adrianople, and other major Ottoman administrative centers, but also dispersed throughout rural areas where agricultural land was available. This migration represented a significant proportion of the total population in affected regions. Thrace, before Ottoman conquest, probably contained approximately 200,000 to 300,000 people and created a visible Turkish presence in territories that had been Greek-speaking and Christian for over a millennium. The demographic transformation, though it would take generations to complete and would never eliminate Greek Christian populations even in heavily Turkish settled areas, nonetheless began the process that would eventually create the ethnically and religiously mixed Balkans that have characterized the region into modern times. The interaction between Turkish Muslim settlers and Greek Christian populations in newly Ottoman-controlled Thrace created complex social dynamics that varied dramatically depending on local circumstances, individual personalities, and the specific policies of Ottoman administrators managing particular regions. In some areas, particularly those where Ottoman officials strictly enforced policies protecting Christian property rights and religious freedom, Turkish and Greek communities coexisted with minimal conflict, maintaining separate social lives and religious practices but interacting regularly in commercial activities and occasionally in shared civic affairs. Turkish farmers and Greek villagers might dispute over water rights or grazing lands, but these were typically practical conflicts about resources rather than manifestations of fundamental religious or ethnic hostility. In other regions, particularly where Ottoman enforcement was weak or where local Turkish commanders permitted abuses, tensions between conquerors and conquered populations sometimes erupted into violence, with Greek Christians resisting Turkish settlement or Turkish settlers taking advantage of their privileged position to dispossess Greeks despite official policies against such practices. The diversity of outcomes reflected the reality that imperial policies, however enlightened in theory, depended on implementation by local officials whose competence and integrity varied significantly. The religious coexistence in Ottoman Thrace, formalized through the millet system that granted the Orthodox Church hierarchy substantial autonomy over Christian communities in exchange for political loyalty to the Ottoman state, created an unprecedented experiment in how Muslim and Christian populations could coexist under unified political authority without either forced conversion or constant communal violence. The Ottoman approach, informed by both Islamic legal traditions about treatment of people of the book and pragmatic recognition that governing Christian majorities required accommodation rather than coercion, permitted Christian worship in existing churches, though new church construction was restricted, allowed Orthodox bishops to adjudicate internal community disputes according to Christian law, protected Christian property rights through legally enforceable guarantees, and even exempted Christians from military service in exchange for special taxes, jizya. This system created conditions where Christianity could survive and even thrive under Muslim governance, a reality that complicated later nationalist narratives that portrayed the Ottoman period as unrelieved oppression. Yet the system also created structural inequalities where Muslims enjoyed privileged status, and where conversion to Islam offered practical advantages in taxation, legal proceedings, and social mobility that created a steady incentive for Christians to abandon their ancestral faith even absent direct coercion. The cultural encounter between Turkish and Greek populations in Ottoman Thrace produced a gradual synthesis and mutual influence that would shape both communities' identities for centuries, as conquerors and conquered adapted to each other's presence through a combination of accommodation, resistance, and creative mixing. Turkish settlers, though politically dominant, often adopted Greek agricultural techniques better suited to Thracian conditions than Anatolian practices they had known, learned the Greek language for practical communication even while maintaining Turkish as their primary tongue, and incorporated Greek architectural and artistic motifs into their buildings and decorative arts. Greek Christians, while maintaining core religious and linguistic identity, adopted Turkish vocabulary for administrative and military terms, consumed Turkish cuisine and incorporated Ottoman elements into their own cooking, and sometimes even adopted Turkish musical forms and clothing styles while firmly resisting conversion to Islam. The children and grandchildren of the first generation of Turkish settlers and Greek subjects who had experienced conquest as adults often developed more complex identities, particularly in regions where intermarriage occurred despite official religious prohibitions, creating hybrid cultural forms that were neither purely Turkish nor Greek but distinctively Ottoman Balkan. The economic integration of Thracian territories into the broader Ottoman commercial system proceeded rapidly as the relative security and effective governance that Ottoman administration provided attracted merchants and stimulated production and trade that had languished during the chaos of late Byzantine decline. The fertile agricultural lands of Thrace, properly cultivated and no longer subject to the constant raiding and political instability that had characterized the region during Byzantine civil wars, began producing substantial surpluses that could feed growing Ottoman military forces and urban populations while generating tax revenues for the imperial treasury. Commercial routes that had been disrupted by warfare and brigandage were secured through Ottoman military presence and vigorous suppression of banditry, allowing merchants to transport goods between Constantinople, Adrianople, and other regional centers with confidence that they would not be robbed or extorted. Markets in Ottoman-controlled towns attracted merchants from throughout the Ottoman domains, and even from Italian maritime republics whose traders recognized profitable opportunities despite the territories being under Muslim governance. The result was an economic revival that made Ottoman Thrace more prosperous during the 1360s than it had been during the final decades of Byzantine rule. A material improvement that helped reconcile populations to Ottoman governance and undermined arguments that Christian rule was inherently superior to Muslim governance. 1359 and 1360 witnessed the completion of the Ottoman conquest of interior Thrace as the final Byzantine strongholds fell to Turkish forces due combinations of military pressure and negotiated surrenders, leaving the Byzantine Empire reduced to Constantinople, a few coastal cities maintained through sea power, and scattered, isolated fortresses whose continued resistance served no strategic purpose beyond symbolic defiance. The systematic nature of the conquest reflected Ottoman strategic planning that prioritized reducing the entire network of Byzantine fortifications rather than merely capturing isolated prizes, while leaving potential resistance centers that might threaten Ottoman rear areas during future operations. Ottoman commanders identified the remaining Byzantine strongholds, assessed their strategic importance and defensive capabilities, and allocated forces methodically to besiege each location in turn or simultaneously when resources permitted. This comprehensive approach, though it required substantial military investment over several years, ensured that when Ottoman forces finally turned their attention northward and westward toward the deeper Balkans, they would not leave a significant Byzantine military presence behind them that could disrupt communications or provide bases for Christian counterattacks. Emperor John V's response to the final collapse of Byzantine Thrace combined desperate military resistance efforts with equally desperate diplomatic initiatives, as the young emperor recognized that losing the empire's European heartland left Constantinople dangerously isolated and vulnerable to an eventual Ottoman siege that might succeed where so many previous attempts had failed. The emperor assembled several relief expeditions during 1359 and 1360, committing whatever military resources Constantinople could generate to attempting to recover lost territories, or at least prevent further Ottoman advances. These Byzantine forces, though occasionally achieving tactical successes in surprising, isolated Ottoman garrisons or ambushing Turkish detachments, could never sustain operations long enough to reverse the strategic situation or seriously threaten consolidated Ottoman positions. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Byzantine military capacity was simply inadequate for the strategic objectives the empire needed to achieve, and no amount of imperial exhortation or desperate bravery by individual soldiers could overcome this structural weakness. Each failed relief expedition further demoralized Byzantine forces and populations, confirming that the empire's decline was irreversible, and that Ottoman domination of the region was a permanent reality that would need to be accommodated rather than resisted. The diplomatic humiliation Emperor John V endured during this period revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted and how desperate the Byzantine position had become, as the emperor found himself compelled to seek Ottoman alliance and support against domestic rivals despite his empire being systematically dismembered by those same Ottoman forces. The bizarre situation resulted from Byzantine internal political divisions that persisted even as the empire faced an existential threat. Various aristocratic factions competed for influence and power, some supporting the emperor while others opposed him, and these domestic enemies sometimes appeared more dangerous to the imperial position than the external Ottoman threat. John V, facing a potential challenge from relatives and rival claimants backed by aristocratic factions, recognized that Ottoman military support might prove decisive in domestic power struggles and consequently sought alliance with Sultan Orhan, despite the Turks simultaneously conquering Byzantine territories. This pattern, Byzantine factions seeking Ottoman military assistance against domestic rivals even while the empire was being conquered by those same Ottomans, exemplified the political dysfunction that had made Byzantine collapse inevitable, and that would characterize the empire's final century as competing factions repeatedly prioritized factional advantage over collective survival. The transformation of Ottoman strategic priorities during the final phase of the Thracian campaigns reflected recognition that the conquest of Byzantine Thrace was essentially complete, and that future expansion would target different regions, including deeper penetration into the Balkans beyond former Byzantine territories and potentially eventually the conquest of Constantinople itself. Sultan Orhan, now 72 years old in 1360, and increasingly delegating operational military command to his son Murad while maintaining overall strategic direction, presided over strategic planning discussions about where Ottoman expansion should focus in the coming years. The options debated included continuing northward and westward into Serbian and Bulgarian territories that offered rich lands and strategic depth, but would inevitably trigger conflict with Balkan Christian kingdoms, consolidating control of conquered territories, and pausing major expansion to allow demographic settlement and administrative integration to transform military conquest into permanent cultural transformation, or beginning preparations for eventual siege of Constantinople itself. The ultimate prize whose conquest would confirm Ottoman status as successor to Rome and dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The decision to pursue continued Balkan expansion while postponing Constantinople's conquest reflected both opportunistic recognition of Balkan weakness and prudent assessment that besieging the Byzantine capital prematurely might trigger a coordinated European response that could threaten even Ottoman conquests in Thrace. The institutional and administrative consolidation of Ottoman rule in Thrace during the early 1360s, following the completion of military conquest, revealed the sophisticated governing capabilities that distinguished the Ottomans from other successful conquerors who could win battles but failed to establish stable administrations. Ottoman authorities conducted comprehensive surveys of newly conquered territories, documenting every significant property, agricultural resource, commercial activity, and demographic detail with thoroughness that enabled effective taxation and military organization. The Timar system was systematically implemented throughout Thrace, with warriors who had distinguished themselves in the conquest campaigns receiving estates whose revenues would support them while they provided military service, creating a self-sustaining military structure that could defend conquered territories without requiring constant treasury expenditures. Courts were established combining Islamic Sharia judges for Muslims and religious matters with recognition of Christian ecclesiastical authority over their own community's internal affairs, providing a legal framework that could adjudicate disputes and maintain order in a multi-religious society. Infrastructure projects were commissioned, including the repair of roads and bridges damaged during warfare, the construction of caravanserais to support commerce, and the building of mosques, madrasas, and bathhouses that would provide both practical services and visible symbols of Ottoman Islamic civilization. These unglamorous administrative activities, though less dramatic than military conquests, proved essential for transforming conquered territories into integral parts of a functioning empire. The death of Sultan Orhan in 1362, occurring as the Thracian conquests reached completion, and as the Ottoman Empire stood poised for further expansion under his son and successor, Murad I, marked the end of an era in Ottoman history and the transition from the empire's foundational period to its classical expansion phase. Orhan died having witnessed the extraordinary transformation of the modest frontier principality he had inherited from his father Osman into a powerful state controlling both Anatolian and European territories, possessing sophisticated administrative institutions, commanding formidable military forces, and positioned to challenge for regional dominance. His achievements establishing the institutional foundations that would govern the empire for centuries, developing the military capabilities that would enable continued expansion, pioneering the diplomatic and administrative approaches that made Ottoman conquest relatively efficient and stable, and most significantly for the Thracian campaigns, authorizing and overseeing the European expansion that would transform Ottoman identity and strategic orientation, positioned his successors to build one of history's great empires. Yet Orhan himself remained a relatively modest figure who avoided grandiose titles or dramatic gestures, focusing instead on practical governance and systematic state-building that would outlast his personal rule. This combination of extraordinary achievement with personal humility explained how a leader who had never become as famous as later sultans like Mehmed II nonetheless accomplished foundational work that made all subsequent Ottoman success possible. Thracian campaigns of the 1350s fundamentally altered the strategic geography of southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, establishing Ottoman presence that would endure for over 4 centuries and creating political, demographic, and cultural patterns that shaped the region's development through the modern era. The conquest of Byzantine Thrace eliminated the last significant Christian buffer between the expanding Ottoman state and the deeper Balkans, opening routes for Turkish expansion into Serbian, Bulgarian, and eventually Hungarian territories that would bring millions of additional Christians under Muslim governance and extend Ottoman power deep into Central Europe. The establishment of Adrianople as the Ottoman capital in Europe signaled the empire's transformation from an Anatolian beylik into a multi-continental power whose political center of gravity had shifted decisively toward European territories, a reorientation that would shape imperial priorities and strategies for generations. Most significantly, the Thracian conquests positioned Ottoman forces to eventually besiege Constantinople, completing the destruction of the Byzantine Empire and claiming for the Ottomans the mantle of Roman imperial succession that would legitimize their rule over diverse populations and territories. The military lessons from the Thracian campaigns influenced Ottoman strategic thinking and operational methods for the next century of expansion, establishing proven approaches that would be replicated in conquests from Hungary to the Middle East. The campaigns demonstrated that systematic, patient reduction of enemy fortified networks through a combination of siege warfare and generous surrender terms achieved territorial conquest more efficiently than seeking dramatic pitched battles that might prove costly even in victory. They proved that effective logistics and supply systems enabling sustained multi-heater operations provided decisive advantages over enemies whose military efforts were episodic and poorly coordinated. They validated the Ottoman model of integrating diverse populations through pragmatic tolerance and effective governance rather than attempting religious or cultural homogenization that would trigger resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the Thracian campaigns confirmed that military conquest alone was insufficient for permanent territorial control. Successful expansion required systematic colonization, administrative integration, and governance that could win, if not enthusiastic support, at least resigned acceptance from conquered populations. These lessons learned through years of Thracian operations guided Ottoman expansion throughout the Balkans and beyond. The demographic transformation begun during the 1350s Turkish settlement programs continued for generations after the initial conquest, gradually shifting population balances in many Thracian regions from Greek Christian majority to mixed or even Turkish Muslim majority that would fundamentally alter the region's ethnic and religious character. The process occurred through multiple mechanisms: continued Turkish migration from Anatolia attracted by available land and economic opportunities, gradual conversion of some Christians to Islam motivated by practical advantages, Muslim status provided in taxation, legal proceedings, and social mobility, the occasional forced deportations of Christian populations from strategically sensitive areas and their replacement with Turkish settlers, and differential birth rates and mortality between communities. By the 16th century, substantial portions of Thrace had Turkish Muslim majorities or near majorities, representing demographic transformation as profound as any in European history, and creating ethnic complexity that would contribute to regional conflicts extending through the modern era. The Ottoman period's demographic legacy remains visible in modern Turkey's European territories and in Turkish minorities that persist in various Balkan countries despite 20th century population exchanges and ethnic cleansing campaigns. The cultural synthesis that emerged from centuries of Turkish-Greek coexistence in Ottoman Thrace created a distinctive regional culture combining Islamic and Christian, Turkish and Greek, Eastern and European elements into a complex hybrid that defied simple categorization. Ottoman Thrace developed architectural styles blending Turkish, Byzantine, and Balkan influences, cuisine combining Anatolian, Greek, and Slavic traditions, musical forms mixing Turkish makam modes with Greek and Balkan melodic patterns, and social customs reflecting both Islamic and Christian influences filtered through Ottoman imperial culture. This cultural creativity, born from the interaction of different traditions within the framework of Ottoman governance that permitted religious and ethnic diversity while maintaining political unity, produced civilization of considerable sophistication and vitality that rivaled achievements of more culturally homogeneous societies. Yet the synthesis also created ambiguities and tensions about identity and belonging that would contribute to nationalist conflicts once Ottoman political authority collapsed, and populations were forced to choose exclusive ethnic identities in ways that the Ottoman system had not required. The economic impact of Ottoman conquest and governance in Thrace, though disrupting during the initial conquest period, generally proved beneficial over the longer term as the security, administrative effectiveness, and commercial integration Ottoman rule provided stimulated production and trade beyond what late Byzantine governance had achieved. The agricultural productivity of Thrace's fertile plains increased under Ottoman administration as the Timar system's incentive structures encouraged development, and as the relative stability Ottoman governance provided allowed farmers to invest in improvements without fear of Byzantine civil wars or arbitrary confiscations. Commercial activity flourished as Ottoman protection of trade routes and merchants attracted business from throughout the empire and beyond, with Adrianople and other Thracian cities becoming major commercial centers whose markets facilitated exchange between European, Anatolian, and eventually Middle Eastern trading networks. The revenues generated from prosperous Thracian territories helped fund continued Ottoman military expansion, while also supporting the architectural and cultural patronage that characterized the Empire's classical period. Modern economic historians analyzing Ottoman tax registers and commercial records have documented that many Thracian regions achieved higher per capita productivity and income under Ottoman rule than they had experienced during Byzantium's declining decades. The Byzantine Empire's final century, following the loss of Thrace, was characterized by tragic recognition that the end was inevitable. It combined with desperate but futile efforts to postpone the final catastrophe through diplomacy, limited military resistance, and appeals to Western Christian powers for assistance that never arrived in adequate strength. Constantinople, isolated and surrounded by Ottoman territories, survived for another 93 years after the completion of the Thracian conquest through combination of the capital's formidable fortifications, Byzantine naval capabilities that maintained sea communications, Ottoman focus on expanding in other directions before concentrating on the final conquest, and occasional breathing space provided when Ottoman succession crises or conflicts with other powers temporarily relieved pressure on the Byzantine capital. Yet the empire's survival during this final period represented mere prolongation rather than revival, as Byzantine territory never significantly expanded beyond Constantinople and immediate environs. The population and resources available to imperial authorities steadily declined, and the political system became increasingly dysfunctional as competing factions pursued short-term advantages at the expense of long-term survival. When Mehmed II finally besieged Constantinople in 1453, the city's fall after 7 weeks of desperate resistance marked not an unexpected catastrophe, but rather the completion of a process that had become inevitable when Ottoman forces conquered Thrace a century earlier. The historical significance of the Ottoman Thracian campaigns of the 1350s extends far beyond immediate military and territorial consequences to encompass a fundamental transformation of southeastern European history that shaped regional development for centuries and created legacies still evident in modern political geography and cultural patterns. The campaigns represented the crucial transition phase when Ottoman expansion evolved from opportunistic exploitation of the Gallipoli earthquake into systematic conquest of substantial European territories, demonstrating that the Turkish presence in Europe would be permanent rather than temporary, and that Ottoman power would become a dominant force in Balkan politics for the foreseeable future. The institutional and administrative structures established during the Thracian conquests provided templates that would be replicated throughout subsequent Ottoman European expansion, creating governance systems that would manage millions of Christian subjects under Muslim Turkish rule for over 4 centuries. Most profoundly, the Thracian campaigns initiated demographic, cultural, and religious transformations that would fundamentally alter the region's character, creating the ethnically and religiously complex Balkans, whose diversity has been both a source of cultural richness and a cause of devastating conflicts. The military legacy of the Thracian campaigns influenced not just Ottoman strategic thinking, but also broader European military development as Christian powers studied Ottoman methods and attempted to develop counters to Turkish tactical and organizational advantages. The campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of combining siege warfare with diplomatic inducement to achieve territorial conquest more efficiently than purely military approaches, a lesson that influenced how subsequent wars of conquest would be conducted throughout Europe. They showcased the importance of logistics and supply systems for enabling sustained operations across extensive territories, capabilities that European powers would need to develop to compete militarily with the Ottomans. Perhaps most significantly, the Thracian campaigns revealed the military advantages that centralized states with professional or semi-professional military establishments possessed over feudal systems relying on periodic levies of inadequately trained aristocratic retainers, helping drive the military revolution that would transform European warfare over subsequent centuries. The Ottoman military model, though never entirely adopted by European powers due to cultural and religious differences, nonetheless influenced European military development to the demonstration of what effective military organization could achieve. The institutional innovations pioneered or refined during the Thracian conquests, particularly the millet system managing religious diversity and the Timar military feudal organization, provided frameworks for governing multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires that influenced not just Ottoman administration but also broader thinking about how diverse populations could coexist under unified political authority. The millet system, granting religious communities internal autonomy under their own leaders in exchange for political loyalty to the Ottoman state, represented a creative solution to governing challenges that pure assimilation or forced conversion could not resolve. The system enabled the Ottomans to rule millions of Christians, Jews, and heterodox Muslims without constant religious warfare or the massive coercive apparatus that purely repressive governance would have required. While the system created structural inequalities and never eliminated religious tensions, it nonetheless proved remarkably stable for centuries and provided a model that other multi-religious empires studied and sometimes emulated. Modern scholarship on pluralism and management of diversity has examined Ottoman precedents as historical examples of how different religious and ethnic communities have coexisted within unified political frameworks, though of course Ottoman solutions reflected medieval assumptions about religious hierarchy that modern liberal democratic values would reject. The demographic transformations initiated during the 1350s Turkish settlement programs created ethnic and religious complexity in the Balkans that has persisted through the modern era and contributed to regional conflicts whose violence has periodically shocked the world. The Turkish Muslim populations established in Thrace and subsequently throughout the broader Balkans during the Ottoman period created communities whose descendants faced persecution and forced migration during the 20th century nationalist conflicts, Balkan Wars, and population exchanges following World War I. The Greek Christian populations who lived under Ottoman rule for centuries developed complex identities, combining Orthodox religious affiliation with accommodation to Turkish governance. Identities that later Greek nationalism would struggle to incorporate into simplified narratives of continuous resistance to Muslim oppression. The conversions to Islam that occurred over generations created communities of Bosnian Muslims, Albanian Muslims, and Bulgarian Pomaks whose identities combined Slavic or Albanian ethnicity with Islamic religion in ways that defied neat categorization and that would make them targets during 20th century ethnic cleansing campaigns. The Ottoman period's demographic legacy thus contributed to the tragic conflicts that have periodically devastated the Balkans from the 19th century through the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. The cultural achievements of Ottoman Thrace, particularly during the classical period when the empire was at its height, demonstrated how multicultural interaction within a stable political framework could produce civilizations of considerable sophistication and vitality. The architecture of Adrianople and other Thracian Ottoman cities combined Turkish, Byzantine, and Balkan influences to create distinctive styles that enriched regional building traditions. The literary production in Ottoman Turkish, Greek, and other languages reflected cross-cultural fertilization as authors from different communities read each other's works and incorporated diverse influences. The musical traditions blending Turkish, Greek, and Balkan elements created new genres that enriched all participating cultures. Even Ottoman cuisine, often cited as one of the world's great culinary traditions, emerged from a synthesis of Turkish, Greek, Arab, and Balkan cooking traditions facilitated by the empire's multicultural character. These cultural achievements, though they would be obscured by nationalist narratives emphasizing conflict and oppression, nonetheless represented genuine accomplishments that enriched all communities participating in Ottoman civilization, and that created a shared cultural heritage that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries. The end of Ottoman rule in the Balkans during the 19th and early 20th centuries, culminating in the empire's final dissolution after World War I, initiated processes of national state formation and ethnic homogenization that attempted to reverse or eliminate the demographic and cultural complexity the Ottoman period had created. The Balkan Wars, population exchanges, and ethnic cleansing campaigns that characterized the region's transition from a multi-ethnic Ottoman province to a system of nation-states produced enormous human suffering and destroyed much of the cultural synthesis the Ottoman period had fostered. Turkish Muslim populations that had lived in the Balkans for centuries were expelled or fled to Turkey, while Greek, Armenian, and other Christian minorities in Anatolia faced similar fates, creating ethnic separation that nationalists viewed as necessary, but that represented a tragic loss of the diversity that had characterized the region for centuries. The nationalist historiographies that emerged in post-Ottoman successor states portrayed the Ottoman period primarily as a time of oppression and exploitation. Narratives that served nation-building purposes but that obscured more complex realities of how different communities had actually lived and interacted under Ottoman governance. The final assessment of the Ottoman Thracian campaigns of the 1350s must acknowledge both their immediate historical significance in establishing permanent Turkish presence in Europe and their longer-term consequences in creating demographic, cultural, and political patterns that shaped southeastern European development for centuries. The campaigns represented methodical military conquests conducted with a sophisticated understanding of how to integrate diverse populations through a combination of military pressure, generous surrender terms, effective governance, and pragmatic tolerance. They demonstrated Ottoman institutional capabilities that distinguished the empire from other successful conquerors who could win battles but not establish stable administrations. They initiated demographic transformations through Turkish settlement that would fundamentally alter the region's ethnic character over subsequent generations. Most significantly, the Thracian campaigns positioned the Ottoman Empire to become dominant power in the Balkans for over 4 centuries, bringing Muslim Turkish governance to millions of Christian Europeans and creating the complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that would be both Ottoman civilization's greatest achievement and ultimately source of conflicts whose violence extended through the 20th century. In this sense, the relatively obscure military operations of the 1350s produced consequences as profound as any in European history, fundamentally altering the continent's political geography and demographic composition in ways that remain visible in the modern Balkans' ethnic complexity and in Turkey's continued European presence.